the free movement of capital has not been as legally impactful as things like the free movement of workers or the free movement of goods, but that isn't to deny its importance. As we'll see in this lecture, the free movement of capital, as well as the economic and monetary union, which we'll also be covering, has had a huge impact on the economics of the European Union, as well as the politics as well. And so that's what we're also going to explore in this lecture. With that in mind, let's get started.
The definition of the free movement of capital comes from Article 63 of the TFEU, which essentially states that all restrictions on the movement of capital shall be prohibited. And in the case of Sanz de Lera, we saw that this has vertical direct effect for citizens, but it was also heavily implied that this would have horizontal direct effect as well. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because institutions such as banks will also have a lot to do with the free movement of capital. This also includes free movement between the EU and third countries, which makes it quite a bit different from some of the other freedoms. But this is less powerful because it only has to be achieved to the greatest extent possible, and there are a number of restrictions that can be put in place when necessary. How do we define the movement of capital? Well, there is a non-exhaustive list that the court can use from Directive 88/361, and there's also a range of cases that we can look to as well. So for loans and investments, we have a case there for that. It would also include things like mortgages and shares, as seen in the test claimants in the FII Group. So a range of things that will be covered under the free movement of capital, quite a broad interpretation, basically anything to do with moving money around in some form or another. Now we need to move on to the exceptions, and direct taxation is the first and probably most obvious exception to the free movement of capital, because this is within the domain of member states, and so long as there is no discrimination based on nationality, then there will be an exception for direct taxation. We see that from Article 65, and there's also a case there which I am not going to try and pronounce, but that is a case that looks at the idea of discrimination and how that is interpreted, which is rather broadly. We now move on to Article 65(1)(b), which is essentially split into two further exceptions to the free movement of capital. So states can take action to prevent infringement of national law, and in order to effectively administer economic policy within their own member state. So you can imagine something like wanting to avoid tax evasion or fraud. States can obviously take action to prevent that sort of illegal activity, even if it is a curb on the free movement of capital. Furthermore, the measure does have to be directly linked to the effective administration of economic policy, and so there has to be objective proof with the burden on the member state to show that their policy is directly linked to, as I said before, things like tax evasion or preventing fraud. There is also a further exception within Article 65(1)(b), and that is an exception for cases of public policy and security. However, this is very tightly interpreted, and also the measures do have to be proportional. In the case of Scientology International, there was an authorization requirement from the state before any sort of capital investment, and this was considered to be far too broad a measure and was disproportional to what needed to be achieved. So that covers the free movement of capital, and now we can move on to the economic and monetary union. And a little bit of background before we get started. The original plan for the economic and monetary union came from 1969, but that was based on the idea of fixed exchange rates between currencies. Now, the US economy in the 1970s moved towards a floating exchange rates, and this impacted on Europe, which meant that they had floating exchange rates too, and essentially the economies of the different European countries drifted apart, and so the idea of an economic and monetary union moved further away, and especially further away from that original plan in 1969. There was a new system that was devised in 1978 called the Economic Monetary System, and this was based on two different things. Firstly, we'd have the European Currency Unit, which was basically a way of measuring the average exchange rate amongst different countries. We also had the exchange rate mechanism, whereby an individual country's currency could be measured against the European currency unit, and that could then be used to give a general assessment of how good the currency of that country was. Now, this was a very good idea in principle, but the problem was that in the early 90s, in particular 1992 and 1993, there was a great deal of fluctuation in the currency markets, and this led to the Great British Pound as well as the Lira falling out of the exchange rate mechanism. And while the exchange rate mechanism did continue after that, the idea of it being a mechanism for controlling currencies sort of flew out of the window because people had already seen it fail. So for establishing an economic and monetary union, the EU basically saw it as a three-stage process. The first one was to do with the completion of the internal market. The second step was the idea of a European system of central banks. And then the third and final stage was the locking of exchange rates and a single currency, which we obviously saw come to fruition with the euro. So one of the most common things that you might be asked about the economic and monetary union is to give an assessment of the advantages and disadvantages, so that's what we'll do now. Some of the positives are that we would have greater economic growth because of lower transaction costs, protection against varied exchange rates and fluctuations, that it would stimulate investment because it would hold interest rates down. We'd also have greater stable prices between the European countries, and also lower inflation because the price of those goods would also not go up as quickly. So that's the positives, but what about the negatives? Well, quite simply, we saw the negatives in the financial crisis after 2008, and in particular the currency crisis of Greece, whereby their rating for paying back on the debt of their currency went down. That made it more expensive for them, and it basically meant Greece spiraled into a crisis and could not get out of it until the European Central Bank essentially stepped in and promised to cover Greece's debts. So this is one of the main problems with the economic and monetary union, is that you're trying to devise an economic or monetary policy across 28 different countries, or at least for the Eurozone, the countries that are using the euro. But you still have different cultures, different politics, and different governments within those countries. And so it's a very strange thing to try and have one single economic or monetary policy across so many different countries. And that might not seem like the best argument against the economic and monetary union, but it is a very persuasive one when you see the way that Europe reacted to this crisis. In the longer term, Europe did try to react more positively, and in 2015 we had the 5 Presidents' Report, which was about how to address future issues with the economic and monetary union, particularly thinking about the financial crisis of the 2008. So the move was actually to double down on the economic and monetary union with further integration, but also to have a suitable adjustment to the global economy as well. Before we finish, I also want to talk quickly about the European Central Bank. We've mentioned it a couple of times and I just want to clear a few things up. So the ECB has a legal personality and is also staunchly independent, as seen in Article 130 of the TFEU. It's actually based on the idea of the German Bundesbank, which is probably one of the most independent central banks in the world, and so the ECB follows suit in that regard. It has responsibility for monetary policy, and it can issue recommendations and opinions which are non-binding but can be persuasive, and they can also issue fines as well. As well as the European Central Bank, we also have the European System of Central Banks, which is slightly different. It's basically made up of the ECB as well as the central banks from all of the different countries within the EU, and their job is to maintain price stability, but they also look at things like the foreign exchange markets and the holding of foreign reserves as well. And the very last thing that we need to talk about is how to actually coordinate economic policy across the European Union. How do we make sure that countries don't fall behind, as we saw with Greece? Well, there are a number of ways of doing this, but perhaps the mechanism for enforcing this is not really very strong. So we can see that under Article 121 we have the concept of multilateral surveillance, which is kind of another way of saying that the responsibility of the economic health of the Union is dependent from one member state to another. And so if there are concerns about another member state, then at the European Council level, then these concerns can be discussed in full and further action can be taken. As a result of that, the Council can issue guidelines and warnings, and the idea of multilateral surveillance was supported by the Stability and Growth Pact. The other measure that we also have is the excessive deficit procedure. The idea here is that the deficit for each year should be less than 3% of GDP, and also the overall debt of a particular member state should be less than 60% of GDP. However, if you were to look at the rates of different countries, you would see that many of the member states do not meet that, and so there has to be a sort of plan in place for them to achieve this, but they can be quite long-term plans, and even if they don't stick to them, there isn't really any forceful action that the European Union can take against member states that breach this deficit procedure.
So out of those two subjects, I think that the free movement of capital is probably the most simple. We have a very simple freedom that is set out in a treaty article, and it's only subject to quite a few limited extensions that are interpreted quite strictly by the Court of Justice. For something like the Economic and Monetary Union, you're going to have to tread a lot more carefully and think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the EMU over time. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and presentation. If you have, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more videos in the future. And if you have any questions at all, leave those in the comments below. Quick reminder about the free ebook that's also available at uklawweekly.com. That's about how to answer problem questions. So if it's an area you're struggling with, make sure to go and sign up for that. Alright, that's all from me. Bye!